And I'm joined now by David Boies. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining me. You're one of America's greatest lawyers. I mean, I don't say that lightly. Right. And I realise that in the general scheme of things, probably this case actually isn't that big a deal for you. Certainly not as big a deal as it has been for us back in the UK.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Although it's still a pretty big deal.
And it gets a lot of attention because it involves a senior member of our royal family, obviously. It's been a year since Prince Andrew settled his civil case with Virginia Giuffre, your client.
Yes.
At the time that it was settled, he had, until that point, repeatedly said, I'm going to clear my name, I'm going to go all the way, I'm going to go to court, and I'm going to have my day, and I'm going to clear my name. And then at the last minute, he caved and paid a large cheque. Were you surprised?
No. This was never a case where I think he could have afforded to go to trial. This was a case where I think the evidence was too strong, and it was going to be very difficult for him to give a deposition. It settled right on the eve of the time when the court had ordered his deposition to be taken. And I think it was a deposition that would have been extremely difficult for him.
Well, certainly with you, because you're known as one of the masterful deposers in legal history. Yeah. You deposed Ghislaine Maxwell. Yes. Had you got Prince Andrew in front of you, I mean, we watched the Newsnight BBC interview with toe curling enough, but do you think that, did that give you all the ammunition you needed, do you think?
Well, it gave a lot of ammunition, but it also said that this is a person who is not going to want to sit for a deposition.
Why?
Well, because, I mean, that was a relatively short interview, and while there were some tough questions, it was generally a very respectful interview. This was going to be a deposition where he was going to have to sit for 7 hours, and he was going to have to ask and answer any question that was relevant to the case. He had said so many things, and his advisors had said so many things to the press on his behalf, that he was going to have a lot of difficulty, I think, reconciling those things with the factual evidence, testimony that people had given, not just my client, but other people.
He's been going around briefing people who then brief the media in the UK that he only settled this to make the problem go away in terms of PR optics, to protect the Queen and so on, that he's never met this woman, none of it was true, blah, blah, blah.
Well, it's interesting. He hasn't said anything to the press about this. And nobody who is one of his advisors or one of his attorneys has said anything, at least for the record. What we have is these innuendos from the shadows saying he only did this because of, but nobody will own up to actually trying to come forward and say that, because the fact of the matter is not true. And I don't think anybody is prepared to put their name to those kind of innuendos.
Did you have any doubt that Andrew was guilty?
Unless you're there, unless you're there witnessing it, or unless you've got a videotape, you never know personally what happened. All you can do is look at the evidence. And the evidence was very strong.
What to you was the most damning part of the evidence?
It's hard. There's so much. Part of it was the photograph. I mean, the photograph made clear that he could not say he never met her. And again, it's so often people, when they start to lie, go so far, and they make statements that are demonstrably untrue. I mean, he could have said, yes, I met her. Yes, I danced with her. But no, there was never any sex. That's something that may be hard to disprove. When he says, I've never met her, and you've got that photograph, and you've got a photograph that Maxwell herself says she thinks is real.
Well, funny enough, she came out on TalkTV in this interview from her prison several weeks ago and said she now thinks the photograph is faked. I don't believe it's real, she said. There's never been an original. Further, there's no photograph. I've only ever seen a photocopy of it. Now, the Mail on Sunday newspaper then did a big investigation on the back of her claim and actually got to the original photographer. And there seemed to be no doubt this was an original photograph.
Right. No,
Did you have any doubt?
I never had any doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, for one thing, the photograph looked real. The second thing, nobody, when they first saw the photograph, said, this isn't real, it didn't happen.
Right.
If somebody shows you a photograph of something that you know didn't happen, you say, that can't be right, because it didn't happen. No one ever said that. It was only afterwards they began to think, well, maybe we can make a claim that it's not real or something like that. But the event clearly happened, because if the event hadn't happened, from the moment that photograph became public, people would have said, it can't be so, because it didn't happen.
Andrew, again, this is what we read in briefings to the media, so we're not entirely sure how much is directly from him, but seems to be inferring that he may now contest the settlement, and he's using as the reason the settlement between Virginia Giuffre and Alan Dershowitz, the lawyer. Obviously, you've been involved in all this, but is there any bearing on the two cases in that sense?
Not in any significant way. Of course, Alan Dershowitz, as part of the settlement, admitted that Virginia Giuffre was honest in her accusations, that she actually believed it was him. So that, to some extent, strengthens. I mean, if Alan Dershowitz, who was one of Epstein's closest friends, his lawyer for many years, was a spokesman for Epstein with the press, if he is admitting that Virginia honestly believes what she was saying, even about him, I think that strengthens her credibility.
There would be some who would say, yes, okay, but she also got it wrong. Well, and if Prince Andrew was to say, she got it wrong with me too, is there any way for him back into this, having settled in the way he did?
Well, first of all, she didn't say she got it wrong. What she said was that under all the circumstances, it's possible it might have been a case of mistaken identity. There's no doubt that there was abuse here, and it was a long time ago. She was very young. It was a very traumatic situation, and I think it was inevitable to admit that there might have been a case of mistaken identity. But the evidence there was what is important, not the question of whether she thinks it's possible that there was a mistaken identity. And as far as Prince Andrew is concerned, we've got the photograph. We've got the photograph of Prince Andrew, Maxwell, and Virginia there at exactly the time that Virginia said. And the date of that photograph, because it was what the Daily Mail found out, was that it was processed at a Walgreens shortly after Virginia said she came back from that trip. So all of the evidence with respect to the legitimacy of that photograph, I think demonstrates that that photograph is real.
And with all your experience of these things, if you establish that Prince Andrew was lying about the photograph, that he had met her, he had put his arm around her, it was with Ghislaine Maxwell at her home, would that in itself have been enough, do you think, to get a conviction? I
think it probably would have been, because you have her testimony and you have his complete denial. So the question is he credible or not? And once the jury concludes that he's not credible about having never met her, I think the jury probably concludes he's not credible about claiming that he did not have sex with her.
And did you think that's why in the end he settled?
Well, I think it was partly that. But I also think that he recognized, and I think his lawyers recognized, that it would be a disaster for him to appear for a deposition. I mean, remember, as you say, I deposed Ghislaine Maxwell, and she was indicted for perjury as a result of that deposition. And I think he would have been taking a terrible criminal risk to appear for a deposition where he'd have to answer these questions under oath.
Right.
And if he did not answer those questions truthfully under oath, he could then expose himself to real criminal liability.
So the risk of criminal liability over perjury alone could have ended up being one of the more serious things he would face.
I think that's right. You see, if you lie to an interviewer, you may embarrass yourself. If you lie in a deposition, you could go to jail.
The Maxwell family released this bizarre photograph of two adults in a bath wearing masks of Prince Andrew and Virginia Giuffre, claiming it proves conclusively the bath was too small for any sort of sex frolicking. When I saw this on the front page of the Telegraph, I was like, actually, it proves to me they can.
Exactly, exactly right. I saw that, and I said, people have had sex in a lot smaller places.
Right.
And
it seemed to be proving the complete opposite of what they thought it would.
It did. It was incomprehensible to me. One of the things that has been a mystery to me throughout this is with Prince Andrew, with Ghislaine Maxwell, with Alan Dershowitz, why they say the kinds of things they do publicly.
Right.
When it doesn't help them. It just undercuts their credibility. And that interview that Prince Andrew gave, the interview just that Ghislaine Maxwell gives from a jail sentence while her case is being appealed. Why in the world would you want to further damage your credibility at that point in time?
Do you think she was just lying through her back teeth in that interview?
I think she's a very troubled person. I think she's in a very troubling situation. I think she never thought that she would find herself in jail. And I think it's very hard to know why she says the kinds of things she says now. But I think she's under a tremendous emotional pressure. I think she's a very damaged person. She's done a lot of horrible things, but I think it's hard as on a human level not to have, a certain empathy for, the pain I'm sure she's going through right now.
Is there any legal way that Andrew can get back into this process again, having settled in the way that he did?
All he has to do is ask.
He can if he wants to.
Well, no, he can't unless we let him. But
who would have to let him?
Virginia would have to let him come back and reopen it. But if he wants to reopen it, he's got my telephone number.
So that's your message?
His lawyer's got my telephone number.
Right. Do you think he's going to make that call?
I do not.
Why?
Because he knows that if he comes back, he's going to be subject to exactly the same scrutiny, exactly the same deposition, exactly the same trial that caused him to settle in the first place.
And the allegations over which he settled were serious. I mean, in some of the sex that he was allegedly having with Virginia Giuffre were in states where it was unlawful. She was underage.
There's no doubt that he could have been prosecuted criminally if prosecutors had either had jurisdiction over him or wanted to. I think one of the things that was disappointing to us in the United States was how lightly the British prosecutorial authorities treated this.
You think that because he was Prince Andrew, a member of the royal family, he got an easier ride than he should have done? I
don't know whether it was because he was a member of the royal family or whether he just was wealthy, could afford good lawyers. Our justice system in the United States, as well as in the United Kingdom, greatly favors people who are well represented. So I think that if he'd been an ordinary chap who had done what he did, I think the prosecutors would have looked at him differently.
Do you think he'd have been charged criminally?
I don't want to say that because I think you've got to look at what the evidence is. And
you've seen all the evidence.
Well, I haven't seen enough evidence to know about criminal charges.
But it would have been a distinct possibility.
I think it would have been a distinct possibility.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
There also, listen, Epstein died in prison.
Right.
Took his life or otherwise, as some people think.
Right.
But many other people who were on that island with him, presumably up to all sorts of stuff, they've all remained secret because a lot of the files have remained secret.
Yeah. I think one of the troubling things about this is Maxwell and Epstein couldn't have done what they did for as long as they did on the scale that they did it without the support and collaboration of many other people. And I think one of the very troubling things about what has happened here is that although it is good to see Maxwell and Epstein held to account, there are many, many other people who have not been held to account. And I think that the U.S. Attorney Berman deserves a lot of credit for what he did, but the subsequent prosecutions, I think, have left a lot to be desired.
There are some very big names that were associated with Epstein. I mean, do you think there are some very rich, powerful people out there who perhaps should be made more accountable for their actions?
Well, I think that's true, and I think there are also some maybe not so rich and powerful people, but that were collaborators who should have been held to account. As I say, you took the very tip of the iceberg here, and it was the most important tip. And if you're going to take two people, Epstein and Maxwell were the right people to take. And I think the prosecutors deserve credit for that. And I think the victims are grateful for that. But I think the victims also believe that there are a lot of other people who should have been held to account that have not been held to account.
You're also involved in many other high-profile cases, one of which is Sam Bankman-Fried, the FTX guy. You're actually representing a high-profile class action suit against him, but also against the celebrity endorsers, including the quarterback Tom Brady, his wife at the time, Gisele Bündchen, comedian Larry David, the NBA star Stephen Curry, tennis star Naomi Osaka. It's interesting. I wrote a column about this for the New York Post saying, well, what about these celebrity endorsers? Why are they not being made accountable?
Exactly. No, exactly right. I mean, so many of our clients say, we invested because X, say Tom Brady, somebody, was endorsing this, and we knew he wouldn't endorse something that wasn't real.
Right.
It gave FTX a credibility that FTX would never have had otherwise, and it gave a credibility to the average person on the street. People were not Wall Street speculators, investors, but people. Some of them put their 401k money into these investments, and the stories that we have from our clients. Put $80,000 in or $130,000 in. Maybe not a large amount in the larger scheme of things, but it was their life savings.
And do you think these celebrities should be personally liable then for some of this?
I think they need to take responsibility, and I think they need to have some liability. They weren't the core.
But they put their name to something that turned out to be a gigantic scam.
They put their names to it, and they misled people. And there's also some legal issues, like were these unregistered securities? But just on the human level, they lent their name to a fraud. And by lending their name to this fraud, they caused a lot of innocent people to lose their money. And I think they need to be held
I completely agree. David, I could talk to you for hours because you've had such an amazing and varied life. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's good
for
to talk
coming
to
in.
you.
I really appreciate it.
Good to talk to you.
Good to see you.
Thank you.